Somewhere off the southwestern coast of Puerto Rico, the ground has been shaking almost without pause for more than 6 years. Not one earthquake, not a cluster that faded after a few tense weeks. Over 9,000 separate earthquakes, still going, still being recorded today, in a sequence so strange that seismologists didn't even have a name for the pattern it was following until they'd spent years trying to make sense of it. And buried inside the 6-year swarm, scientists just found something they never expected to see hiding beneath this specific island. A discovery that's forcing researchers to rewrite what they thought they understood about how Puerto Rico's crust is actually built. Today, we're breaking down exactly what's been happening beneath southwestern Puerto Rico since the final days of 2019, why the sequence still doesn't behave like any earthquake pattern scientists have a simple label for, and what the newest research says about the hidden fault system responsible for all of it. Here's what makes this story genuinely different from most Caribbean earthquake coverage. This isn't a single dramatic event with a clean beginning, middle, and end. It's a 6-year mystery that's still actively unfolding, one where the scientists studying it have had to admit repeatedly that the sequence simply doesn't behave the way earthquake sequences are supposed to behave. And the longer it's continued, the more it's revealed about a fault system that had been sitting undetected beneath one of the most densely populated islands in the entire Caribbean for who knows how long before the ground finally started talking. Let's start with how this actually began, because the opening days of this sequence remain one of the most intense earthquake experiences any American community has lived through in the last decade. On December 28, 2019, a magnitude 4.7 earthquake struck off the southwestern coast of Puerto Rico, quickly followed by a magnitude 5. 0 event in the early hours of the next day. Over the following week, the region was hit by smaller earthquakes in rapid succession. Then, on January 6, 2020, a magnitude 5. 8 struck. The next morning, before dawn, a magnitude 6. 4 earthquake tore through the region, the strongest to hit Puerto Rico since 1918, when a quake off the island's northwest coast had triggered a tsunami and killed 116 people. This new magnitude, 6. 4 event was followed within 10 minutes by a magnitude 5, 6 aftershock, and roughly 15 minutes after that, a magnitude 5. 0. 4 days later, another magnitude 5. 9 struck. Within the first month of the sequence alone, the region had experienced 11 separate earthquakes of magnitude 5 or greater, alongside 82 more in the magnitude 4 range. And by the time researchers finished counting several years later, the total sequence had produced more than 9,000 individual earthquakes of magnitude 2, 5 or greater, spread across an area of roughly 1,500 square kilometers, a sustained level of seismic activity that continued, according to the most recent published research, all the way into February 2026, more than 6 years after that first magnitude 4.7 tremor. The human toll of the opening weeks was genuinely severe, and it landed on a population that was still recovering from one of the worst disasters in modern American history, the magnitude 6. 4 earthquake killed 4 people and caused an estimated $3.1 billion in economic damage, according to detailed post-event assessments. In the town of Guanica, home to roughly 15,000 people and one of the communities hit hardest by the sequence, nearly 150 homes were damaged, along with 3 schools, including a 3-story school building where 2 entire floors completely collapsed. A landmark building, the Immaculate Conception Church in nearby Guayanilla, was reduced to rubble. Across the affected region, hundreds of homes and businesses were damaged or destroyed entirely. Puerto Rico's governor at the time, Wanda Vázquez Garcet, declared a major disaster and requested federal aid for the hardest-hit towns, Guanica, Guayanilla, Peñuelas, Ponce, and Yauco, a combined population of more than 200,000 residents, many of whom evacuated their homes entirely, afraid the structural integrity of buildings that had survived the initial shaking could no longer be trusted. What followed was one of the more difficult, sustained humanitarian responses of any recent American natural disaster, precisely because the earthquakes simply refused to stop. Public health researchers, who later studied the response, documented that residents began assembling in improvised camp settlements almost immediately, along roadsides, in parks, in empty parking lots. Anywhere that offered open space away from buildings people no longer trusted to remain standing. Puerto Rico's Emergency Management Bureau eventually established 5 large tent-based camps to provide displaced residents with food, basic medical care, sleeping areas, and sanitation services, and at peak occupancy in mid-January 2020, more than 4,100 people were registered across these official camps alone. With untold additional numbers sheltering in informal, unregulated tent settlements, the government wasn't even tracking. Photographers documenting the response described a population gripped by genuine, sustained fear rather than the kind of shock that typically fades within days of a single earthquake. People were sleeping outside in tents or in their own cars, specifically because they didn't want to get caught under a roof if a bigger earthquake struck, afraid of returning to buildings that might collapse on top of them in the middle of the night. It's worth understanding exactly why the timing of this sequence made the psychological toll so much worse than a comparable earthquake might have caused almost anywhere else in the country. Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico in September 2017, killing nearly 3,000 people through a combination of the storm itself and the prolonged public health crisis that followed months of lost power, clean water, and functioning hospitals across the island. By the time the earthquake sequence began in December 2019, barely 2 years later, many of the same communities in southwestern Puerto Rico were still living with blue tarps covering damaged roofs, still rebuilding homes and businesses that had never been fully repaired, and still carrying the accumulated financial and emotional exhaustion of one of the most devastating storms in modern American history. Asking that same population to now evacuate their homes a second time, sleep outdoors a second time, and rebuild a second time, this time from a hazard that offered no advance warning and no clear end date, represents exactly the kind of compounding disaster scenario that emergency management researchers now study specifically, because it reveals how thin the margin for recovery really is in communities that haven't been given adequate time to fully heal from the last catastrophe before the next one arrives. That fear turned out to be entirely rational because the sequence kept producing damaging earthquakes for months, a magnitude 5. 5 earthquakes struck in the same area months later, jolting residents from their beds in communities where hundreds of people were still living in shelters from the original January quakes. Journalists, who returned to Guanica more than a month after the initial sequence, found unregulated encampments still standing. Residents describing an almost complete absence of government follow-up, left largely to rely on supplies from local mutual aid initiatives rather than any sustained, coordinated official recovery effort. This was a community trying to recover from a still active earthquake sequence while simultaneously still working through the unresolved trauma and physical damage left behind by Hurricane Maria, which had killed nearly 3,000 people and left millions without power or water just 2 years earlier. Layering a still ongoing earthquake sequence directly on top of an already fragile, still recovering disaster zone created exactly the kind of compounding crisis that public health researchers now cite as a case study in how consecutive disasters can overwhelm even well-intentioned emergency response systems. Here's where this story becomes genuinely unusual from a scientific standpoint, and it's the reason seismologists have kept such close, sustained attention on this specific sequence for more than 6 years now, well beyond what almost any other earthquake sequence in recent American history has received. Most earthquake sequences fall cleanly into one of 2 recognizable categories. There's the main shock-aftershock pattern, where one dominant earthquake strikes followed by a clear, gradually decaying series of smaller aftershocks that fade out according to a well-understood mathematical pattern. Seismologists call Omori decay, the kind of sequence most people are at least loosely familiar with. Then there's a genuine earthquake swarm, a sustained burst of seismicity with no single dominant main shock, often associated with fluid movement or slow slip processes, rather than a single sudden rupture. The Puerto Rico sequence stubbornly refuses to fit cleanly into either category. Researchers who studied it in detail found it displayed a genuinely confusing mixture of both patterns simultaneously, an abrupt onset and sustained high rate of activity without a clear triggering main shock, characteristic of a swarm, but with several distinct embedded main shock aftershock sequences woven throughout it, characteristic of the opposite pattern entirely. This hybrid behavior is genuinely unusual, and it's part of why the sequence has attracted sustained academic attention well beyond what its initial death toll or damage total alone might have generated. It's worth understanding just how much technical effort went into simply cataloging this sequence accurately, because a swarm producing over 9,000 individual earthquakes across 6 years generates far more raw seismic data than researchers could ever hope to review manually, one recording at a time. Separate research teams studying this same sequence turned to modern deep learning techniques specifically to help manage that overwhelming volume, training models to automatically detect, locate, and classify individual earthquakes within the continuous stream of seismic data recorded by the Puerto Rico Seismic Network. This kind of automated approach allowed researchers to build a far more complete and precise catalog of the sequence than traditional manual analysis ever could have achieved in a reasonable time frame. And it's part of a broader pattern across modern seismology, where increasingly sophisticated computational tools are making it possible to extract genuinely new scientific insight from earthquake sequences that would have simply overwhelmed research teams working with older, manual cataloging methods just a decade or 2 earlier. This kind of automated approach allowed researchers to build a far more complete and precise catalog of the sequence than traditional manual analysis ever could have, achieved in a reasonable time frame, And it's part of a broader pattern across modern seismology, where increasingly sophisticated computational tools are making it possible to extract genuinely new scientific insight from earthquake sequences that would have simply overwhelmed research teams working with older, manual cataloging methods just a decade or two earlier. The Puerto Rico Seismic Network itself, based at the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez, has played a central role in making this level of sustained, detailed monitoring possible in the first place. Unlike many smaller Caribbean island nations that lack the resources to maintain dense, continuously operating seismic networks, Puerto Rico's status as a U.S. territory has meant access to comparatively robust federal monitoring infrastructure, dozens of seismic stations, and GPS monitoring points spread across the island feeding data back in near real time. That density of coverage is precisely what allowed researchers to track this sequence with the kind of precision needed to eventually identify the conjugate faulting pattern, a level of instrumental coverage that many other seismically active Caribbean nations, working with a fraction of the monitoring budget, simply don't have access to for their own comparable hazards. That sustained attention has now produced a genuinely significant new finding. Researchers publishing in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Solid Earth in early 2026, conducted a detailed analysis of the fault mechanics underlying the entire sequence, using satellite radar data, precise earthquake location techniques, and analysis of how different sections of the crust actually moved during the 6-year swarm. What they found reshapes the basic picture of how this part of Puerto Rico's crust is actually structured. Detailed modeling of the magnitude 6. 4 main shock, using satellite radar interferometry data, capable of detecting ground deformation with remarkable precision, revealed that the earthquake occurred on a north-dipping fault, part of a specific structure known as the Punta Montalva Fault. But the broader sequence surrounding that main shock revealed something considerably more complex sitting beneath the region. Analyzing focal mechanism solutions, essentially a technique for determining exactly how the rock on either side of a fault moved during each individual earthquake, researchers identified evidence of what geologists call conjugate faulting, or 2 separate sets of faults oriented at meaningfully different angles to each other, both active within the same sequence, each accommodating a different component of the overall tectonic stress affecting the region. To understand why this discovery genuinely matters, you have to understand the broader tectonic setting Puerto Rico sits within, because it's considerably more geologically complicated than most people realize. Puerto Rico sits along a zone of oblique subduction, where the North American plate isn't diving directly beneath the Caribbean plate, at a clean, simple angle the way subduction is often pictured, but is instead being forced under at a slanted oblique angle relative to the plate boundary itself. That obliqueness creates genuinely complex internal stresses within the overriding crust, stresses that don't resolve cleanly along a single fault the way a simpler, more head-on collision might. Researchers studying continuous GPS station data from across the region found that stations sitting on the southwestern edges of specific fault segments showed a consistent southward motion, while stations positioned on the northeastern side of those same structures showed a consistent northward motion. A pattern researchers determined was best explained by left lateral, horizontal sliding motion along 2 distinct fault systems operating simultaneously, rather than the kind of single, straightforward vertical or normal faulting movement earlier simpler models had assumed. This matters enormously because it suggests these 2 conjugate fault systems haven't simply activated for the first time during this specific 6-year sequence. The GPS deformation pattern researchers documented appears to reflect a longer-term, ongoing geological process, evidence that these left lateral fault systems have likely been active repeatedly throughout the broader Holocene period, the roughly 12,000-year stretch since the end of the last ice age, rather than representing some entirely new structural feature that spontaneously appeared in December 2019. In other words, southwestern Puerto Rico appears to sit above a genuinely persistent and long-lived conjugate fault system that had gone largely undetected, or at least not fully characterized, until a 6-year earthquake sequence finally provided researchers with enough data to map it in real detail. This discovery genuinely matters for hazard planning across the island, and it's part of why the ongoing sequence continues to draw such close scientific attention even years after the initial, most dramatic phase passed. Puerto Rico's official seismic hazard maps and building codes have to be built around an accurate understanding of exactly which faults exist beneath the island, how they're oriented, and how they're likely to behave during future earthquakes. A previously underappreciated conjugate fault system, one capable of producing a magnitude 6, 4 earthquake, and sustaining 6 years of continued activity, represents exactly the kind of structural detail that can meaningfully reshape those hazard assessments once it's been properly documented and incorporated into the models emergency planners and engineers actually rely on. It's also worth understanding that this sequence hasn't remotely stopped, even years after it first captured national attention. Recent seismic monitoring throughout 2026 continues to show regular, ongoing activity concentrated in almost exactly the same communities that bore the brunt of the original 2019 to 2020 sequence. In early July 2026 alone, monitoring networks recorded multiple magnitude 3 and 4 earthquakes clustered around Indios, Isabella, and Hatillo, with a magnitude 3, 9 events striking near Indios and a magnitude 4, 0 event near Hatillo within days of each other. Activity has continued through the summer months as well, with earthquakes recorded near Guanica and Esperanza in mid-July, and additional tremors near Vieques later that same month. None of these individual events approaches the destructive scale of the January 2020 main shock, but their sheer persistence, more than 6 years after the sequence technically began, illustrates exactly why researchers describe this as one of the most sustained, scientifically significant earthquake sequences anywhere in the Caribbean in recent memory, a slow-motion seismic event that has simply never fully concluded. Puerto Rico's broader seismic context makes this ongoing activity considerably more consequential than it might otherwise be. The island sits immediately beside the Puerto Rico Trench, the deepest point anywhere in the Atlantic Ocean, plunging more than 8,300 meters down, where a complex zone of oblique subduction and associated transform faulting has produced serious earthquakes throughout the island's recorded history. Based on historical records stretching back to 1900, Puerto Rico experiences an average of roughly 4,700 earthquakes annually, and the region has recorded at least 5 earthquakes above magnitude 7 during that same span, suggesting a major earthquake at that scale strikes somewhere near the island roughly once every 25 to 30 years on average. The largest earthquake recorded near Puerto Rico during the modern instrumental era was a magnitude 7, 8 event in August 1946, centered roughly 180 miles west-southwest of Ponce, a genuine reminder that the southwestern swarm, however sustained and scientifically significant, represents only one piece of a considerably larger, more complex seismic hazard picture surrounding the entire island. This is precisely why the newly documented conjugate fault system carries weight well beyond the specific southwestern communities that have lived through 6 years of continued shaking. Understanding exactly how stress is being accommodated across multiple, previously underappreciated fault structures feeds directly into broader regional hazard models covering the entire island, models that inform building codes, insurance risk assessments, and emergency planning for the more than 3 million American citizens living across Puerto Rico. If left lateral conjugate faulting of the kind documented in this specific sequence turns out to be a more widespread feature of the island's crust than previously understood, rather than a phenomenon unique to this one specific corner of the southwest coast, it would represent a genuinely significant addition to how seismologists model earthquake risk across the broader Puerto Rico region going forward. There's also a genuinely human dimension to why scientists have continued monitoring this sequence so closely for so long, beyond the pure research value of documenting a newly identified fault system. The communities of Guanica, Guayanilla, Peñuelas, Ponce, and Yauco spent years living with the psychological weight of not knowing whether the earthquakes had actually stopped, or whether they were simply in a temporary lull before another significant event struck. Seismologists studying earthquake swarms generally acknowledge a genuinely difficult reality when trying to reassure an anxious, still recovering population that, unlike a clean main shock aftershock sequence where the mathematics of Amori decay allow scientists to offer at least a rough probability estimate for when activity will meaningfully taper off, a hybrid sequence like this one, still producing magnitude 3 and 4 earthquakes across multiple towns 6 years after it began, doesn't offer that same reassurance. Researchers studying the sequence have been genuinely candid that predicting exactly when or whether this specific pattern of activity will finally conclude remains beyond current scientific capability, precisely the kind of honest uncertainty that made the extended recovery so much harder for residents trying to decide whether it was finally safe to return home permanently. So what does all of this mean for the people currently living across southwestern Puerto Rico? And for the broader picture of Caribbean seismic hazard scientists continue to build one sequence at a time? The newly documented conjugate fault system doesn't necessarily mean a larger earthquake is now more likely than previously understood, and researchers have been careful not to overstate the immediate hazard implications of this specific structural finding. What it does represent is a genuinely significant improvement in scientists' understanding of exactly how this part of the Caribbean plate boundary actually works, mapped only because an unusually persistent, scientifically unprecedented 6-year sequence provided researchers with an extraordinary volume of data that a shorter, more conventional earthquake sequence simply never would have generated. Every magnitude 3 tremor still rattling communities like Indios and Guanica today is quietly adding to that same data set, refining scientists' understanding of a fault system that remained essentially invisible to researchers until the ground itself finally revealed it, one earthquake at a time, across more than 6 years and counting. That's the story still unfolding beneath southwestern Puerto Rico right now, a 6-year earthquake sequence that broke the standard categories scientists use to classify seismic activity, forced open a previously hidden conjugate fault system beneath one of the most densely populated islands in the Caribbean, and left thousands of residents to rebuild not once, but repeatedly, against a backdrop of shaking that simply never fully stopped. Scientists continue monitoring this region as closely as almost anywhere else in the Caribbean, not because a catastrophic new earthquake is believed to be imminent, but because a sequence this persistent, this scientifically unusual, and this revealing about the island's hidden fault structure demands exactly that level of sustained attention. Stay with this channel, because we'll keep tracking every new tremor and every new study coming out of this remarkable, still active corner of the Caribbean. And this is exactly the kind of story where the ground itself is still actively teaching scientists something new, one earthquake at a time.